Greetings, everyone. My name is Ross Emmett, and I'm the director of the Center for the Study of Economic Liberty at Arizona State University. And I'd like to welcome you to another lecture in the series we sponsor called Perspectives on Economic Liberty. The series emerges from the center's mission, which is to evaluate the contribution of economic liberty to human betterment. Our goal is to undertake research that affects liberty-enhancing policy in Arizona and elsewhere, and also increase public and academic awareness of the history and philosophy of economic liberty. Our capstone publication is the annual Doing Business North America report, which collects data for 125 cities across the United States, Canada, and Mexico regarding the life cycle of small to medium-sized businesses across all those cities. We also support researchers engaging with the history and philosophy of economics through our bi-weekly Philosophy, Politics, and Economics Research Seminar and an annual Institute for the History of Economic Thought, usually held in the winter. The center is also in the process of taking on a new role, providing support and programming and events for a Philosophy, Politics, and Economics Certificate program, which is now available to students across the university through the School of Civic and Economic Thought and Leadership. The certificate program includes an introductory course challenging students to think about the ways in which philosophy, politics, and economics both support and challenge each other, at least one course from each of the three participating programs, and a capstone seminar that provides students with the opportunity to consider how to integrate the three disciplines together in an extended project. But today our guest is Virginia Postrel, most recently author of The Fabric of Civilization, How Textiles Made the World. Here, I'll hold up my copy of the book. It's published about 1.5 years ago. Her fourth book, The Fabric, builds on the themes of her earlier books, The Future and Its Enemies, The Substance of Style, and The Power of Glamour. Each of those books speaks to the dynamism of economic organization through markets and the forward-looking and change-seeking people who emerge and thrive by embracing that dynamism in their market context. These are the people who make all things new. For the audience, Virginia will speak for 30 minutes. There'll be time for questions at the end of her talk. And you submit questions by entering them into the Q&A. Look at the bottom of your Zoom screen, which is monitored. And then I will pose the questions that appear there to Virginia. Virginia, welcome to the Center for the Study of Economic Liberty. We look forward to your talk.
Thank you very much. Share my screen here. I need to be able to share my screen.
Try now.
Okay. All right, here we go. So the fabric of civilization is about a very big subject, which is the history of textiles all around the world from prehistory to the near future. And so in order to get a handle on this very big subject and to write a normal sized book and not a library, I had to come up with a very particular structure for the book, which I will get into in a minute. But before I do that, I want to show a video that gives you kind of an overview of the themes of the book. The word textiles comes from the Indo-European root tex, which means to weave. It's the same root that gives us the word technology. Textiles are such an old technology that we rarely think about them. They hide in plain sight. From the moment we are born, we are surrounded by cloth. We sleep among textiles, walk on them, wash, and dry with them. Textiles protect us from the elements. They carry our stuff. They help us celebrate. Textiles are everywhere. Textiles go to war. They keep us safe. And bandage wounds. They provide comfort and joy. The story of textiles is older than history and younger than tomorrow. It stretches back to cave dwellers twisting plant fibers into string and forward to scientists embedding threads with computer chips. It is the story of human ingenuity in all its manifestations, artistic and technical, economic and cultural. The pursuit of cloth gave us germ theory. It led to the belt drive and the chemical industry. It built factories and finance. Textile traders spread the alphabet and Arabic numbers. Literacy and bookkeeping. They funded the Italian Renaissance and the Mughal Empire, the David and the Taj Mahal. The story of textiles is a story of commerce and culture, a story of peaceful trade and savage wars. The story of textiles is a human story. It's a story made by women and by men, by famous leaders and forgotten peasants. It's a story of art and science, of economics and religion. It's a global story set in every time and place. It is humanity's story. It is our story. Please join me in exploring the fabric of civilization, how textiles made the world. So the way the book is structured is each chapter has, in a sense, a warp thread. That is the thread that holds the cloth together in tension, and that is a stage in what I call the textile journey, from fiber to thread to cloth to dye, and then out into the world with traders and consumers. And then there's a final chapter called Innovators, which starts with the development of nylon and polymer fibers and reaches forward to some of the cutting edge research that's being done today. And then, just like cloth has a horizontal and a vertical, a warp and a weft, there is a theme that limits the discussion of what's in that chapter. And for the chapter on fiber, that theme is there's no such thing as a natural fiber. Even the biological fibers that we refer to as natural are products of many, many centuries, even millennia, of human ingenuity and human artifice. So let's take the most common so-called natural fiber in the world today, which is cotton. I think most of us have a pretty good idea of what cotton looks like before it's turned into thread. It is a plant about waist high. It has big white fluffy bolls. You may know that that the cotton harvest is in the fall. None of this is natural. Cotton does not naturally have its bolls in the fall, but rather in the winter. It's naturally a tropical plant that couldn't grow in places like Mississippi that have frost. It is a tree rather than a bush, and it is not nearly that white and fluffy. It doesn't have nearly that amount of lint, as they say in the business, on it. So I learned about cotton by visiting, of all places, Iowa State University, where this fellow, Jonathan Wendell, is one of the world's foremost experts on cotton genetics and the evolution of cotton. And one of the things I learned from him is that there are roughly 50 different species of cotton around the world, most of which are represented in his wonderful greenhouse here on the top of his building, and that most of these species have no more fiber on them than a peach. Have pretty flowers, they look like hibiscus, but they do not give us fiber. Only once in the entire history of cotton was there a mutation that turned those cells into fiber cells. And that happened someplace in Africa, probably around what is now Uganda, on a plant that was the ancestor of this one that we see here. This is the wild African cotton. And you can see how small the flowers are, and that gives you some idea of how small the bolls of cotton would be on this wild cotton. So this mutation happened one time. The cotton, for reasons scientists have no idea why, it developed fiber, and that mutation survived and thrived. And when human beings came around, they domesticated it and created 4 distinct cotton species, 2 in the New World and 2 in the Old. Now, if you think about geography, you might be asking, if cotton started in Africa, how did it get to the New World? And the answer is, we don't know, but we know it did. We know that cotton like this, which is the African version, which the scientists refer to the genome as A, somehow got across the ocean to what is now Mexico, the Yucatan, and there it crossbred with one of those cottons that doesn't have any fiber on it, which scientists call D, and something weird happened, or it would be weird in animals. It's fairly common in plants, which is, instead of getting half the genes from the father and half from the mother, so to speak, it got all the genes from both. So it had twice as much genetic material as the original African cotton. And the result was that many, many thousands of years later, when human beings showed up in the Americas, they had more genetic material to work with. So human beings come along and they change cotton. These are the 2 New World species. This is Gossypium hirsutum, which is sometimes called upland cotton, which is the cotton that accounts for 90% of all the world's commercial cotton production today. This is what it looks like in the wild, lot less lint, brown, and this is what it looks like in its cultivated state. Human beings did this. This is native to the Yucatan. Gossypium barbadense, sometimes called Pima or Sea Island cotton, sometimes incorrectly called Egyptian cotton, is native to Peru. And this is what it looks like in the wild. Hardly any fiber at all compared to these beautiful long strands that were produced by crossbreeding by human beings. And this is one of the old world cottons, Gossypium herbaceum, sometimes called Levant cotton, and this is what it looks like in the wild, and this is what it looks like in its cultivated form. So the point is, cotton is a biological, botanical fiber, but it is not truly a natural fiber. Human beings made cotton what we know today. So we've got our fiber, whether it's from cotton, wool, whatever. We need to turn it into thread because those little fibers are short and they're weak. And to make them strong and long, we need to find ways to twist them and lengthen them. Throughout most of human history, that was the job that kept women busy. In the Middle Ages, a saying developed, and you can see it here in the artwork, when Adam delved and Eve span, who then was the gentleman? Span used to be the past tense of spinning. Spinning was the quintessential female activity because women spent all their lives spinning. You can see it on Greek vases. You can see it in Golden Age Dutch art. You can see it all over European art. In particular, women are shown as spinning. They're shown, no matter how you want to depict a woman, whether it's the Virgin Mary or a Greek prostitute, you show her spinning. And spinning was also the allegory, as they say in art history, of industry. If you wanted to show the three major ways of economic production: agriculture, you show that man digging; commerce, you show a man in his counting house; and industry, in the days before it became smokestacks, was a woman spinning, because this was the fundamental manufacturing activity. And there were two different ways of doing it. The first was developed all over the world, and that is what you see on this Greek vase, which is called a drop spindle, which is basically a stick with a weight on one end. It could be at the top or it could be at the bottom. The weight keeps the angular momentum going. You put the fiber on it, you set it spinning, and you feed the fiber onto it. Later, about 2,500 years ago, someplace probably in China, somebody had the bright idea to turn that on its side, run a string between a big wheel and a little wheel, and let you turn the little wheel many times by turning the big wheel once. This developed into what is called the spindle wheel, best known in its Indian form of the charka, and later into the European spinning wheel, as you see here. So I'm going to show a little video that shows what this looks like in action. We have an Andean spinner from Peru first, who is spinning alpaca. And then we have a woman from Laos who is spinning cotton. So she's using a drop spindle. She's got the ball of the fiber under her arm. You can see it a little more closely here, and it looks like magic. It seems like it's coming out of the air, and you can see why spinning in many mythologies is a representation of birth or creation, because it creates something out of nothing. It creates order out of chaos. But it took a long time to make enough thread for anything. There are about, believe it or not, 6 miles of thread in the denim required to make a single pair of jeans. And in the days before the Industrial Revolution, it would have taken the fastest and best spinners in the world, those using the Indian charka, about 100 hours to spin the thread to weave a single pair of jeans. And that does not include cleaning the cotton, ginning the cotton, doesn't include any of that, picking it, all that. And it doesn't include weaving the cloth or dyeing the cloth. It's strictly for the thread. And you can see I compiled this chart from a lot of different scholars' works to show how different technologies that were used around the world and at different times on different fibers. So there's playing a little fast and loose there, how long they took to make various things. So textiles in the pre-industrial revolution days were incredibly precious because it took so long to make them. It took longer than a year, the equivalent of 385 8-hour days, to spin the thread just to make a single Viking sail. And that's, again, just spinning. That's not plucking the wool. It's not cleaning the wool. It's not weaving. It's not sewing those woven panels together or dyeing them if you want the red stripes. From start to finish, the sail took longer to create than the ship. And it's not as though they were using power tools to make those ships. And in the Viking sagas, there's a hero that the only time in his life that he cries is when somebody steals his sail, because it is such a precious and difficult to replace and essential technological artifact. So we have come to take thread and cloth for granted, because in the late 18th century, something changed. In the late 18th century, on the cusp of the Industrial Revolution, Arthur Young traveled throughout Britain and recorded all kinds of things about the economy. And one of the things he recorded was that it took 20 to 30 spinners to feed the loom of a single weaver, and that many times the weavers didn't have enough thread. That changed a decade or so later with the development of spinning machines. And when you understand how much thread it took to make anything, you start to understand how, aside from the inspiration for other kinds of machines, why the Industrial Revolution started with spinning machines. Because suddenly cloth became far more available. And of course, that meant that people could have many more and better and cheaper clothes, but it meant a lot of other things. It meant sacks for carrying goods. It meant sails. It meant all kinds of belts and straps. It rippled throughout the economy once we had abundant thread. So I'm going to skip over the creation of cloth, which you can read about in the book, Cloth as Embodied Code, a form of mathematics in the everyday world, and get to dye, because dye is fascinating, and many people find it the most interesting chapter of the book. So sticking to our blue jeans theme, I'm going to talk particularly about indigo. And one reason is that the earliest dyed cloth we have is dyed with indigo. This is 6,200-year-old cloth that was found at a site in Peru where it's very dry, and so that's why it was able to survive. And you see on the right is what it actually looks like, and on the left is a computer reconstruction so you can see the structure. This is fascinating because 6,200 years ago, people were, by any definition, incredibly poor. They were living a subsistence existence. And yet they saw cloth as something that was more than just a practical thing to cover your body with or to carry things with. It was something to be made beautiful and meaningful. And they went to a lot of trouble to create stripes in 3 different colors. They used the sort of tan natural color of the wild cotton or cultivated cotton, the cotton in the area. They dyed some of the cotton blue with indigo, using a local plant, and they also collected very bright white fibers from a local milkweed plant, which they spun along with the cotton to make whiter stripes. Cloth and artifacts of all kinds for human beings, it's not just about practical necessity. It's also about beauty, and it's about meaning. And we see that very much in the history of dyes, people going to great trouble to figure out complex chemical reactions long before the invention of chemistry through trial and error in order to create beautiful colored textiles. So indigo is an extremely weird process. It is extremely chemically complex. An indigo vat will have sort of blue bubbles, but the surface will be a kind of antifreeze green. And you dip your cloth into it, and it comes out green. Comes out really a green cloth, and then as it's exposed to the air, it turns blue. And the darker, if you want it darker, you have to dip it more times. Well, what's going on is this. But of course, this is something that people figured out relatively recently. Yet all around the world, in India, of course, where we get the word indigo, in Europe, where it was a plant called woad, in Japan, all over Africa, in Southeast Asia, in Indonesia, all around the world, not just in Latin America, all around the world, using different and completely unrelated plants, people figured out that you could make a beautiful blue dye through an incredibly complicated process. And they did it by trial and error. Jeffrey Splitzdozer, who worked on the site in Peru, says, in the modern world, we sometimes think of ancient people as primitive with a lack of understanding about the world, but really you had to be pretty smart to live back then. And I love this quote because when you study textile history, you come to appreciate 2 things. One is how incredibly intelligent and creative human beings have been all around the world for all of human history and before. And the other is you come to appreciate the knowledge that we've built up, because the truth is that ancient people did have a lack of understanding about the world. They were able to get very, very far with trial and error learning without understanding what was going on at the underlying chemical level. They never heard of molecules, they never heard of atoms, they never heard of oxidation, any of these things, and yet they made indigo and other dyes work. It's really only in the 16th, 17th, and really the 18th century that you start to have a scientific understanding of chemistry, culminating in Antoine Lavoisier's elementary treatise on chemistry in 1789. And even then, it takes a long time, even though people are trying very hard to apply that knowledge to make dyes, it takes a very long time before they figure out how to turn that chemical knowledge into new forms of dye. And it all starts with this guy, William Perkin, in 1856. Now, William Perkin in 1856 looked nothing like this old guy in the picture. He was an 18-year-old chemistry student in London who went home on his Easter vacation to his parents' home, where he had a little lab set up. And he took some supplies because he was working on trying to turn a kind of industrial waste called coal tar into a very valuable anti-malaria drug called quinine. So he's conducting these experiments over his vacation, and it was a total catastrophe, total flop. He didn't get quinine. He didn't get anything that looked like quinine. He just got this kind of black powder. But being a curious experimental sort of guy, he decided, oh, what would happen if I dissolve this black powder in some denatured alcohol? And he did that, and lo and behold, it turned a brilliant purple. And Perkin at that time was living in a society where the textile industry was huge, so he had an idea that wouldn't necessarily occur to somebody in a different context, which was, hey, maybe I could turn this purple into a dye. I could start a company, I could make a lot of money. So he called up a guy in the business, and the guy said, absolutely, if you could come up with a purple dye that would work on cotton and silk, that would be great, because purple is super fashionable right now, but we don't have good dyes for cotton and silk. We're okay with wool, but not cotton and silk. So he said, okay, I'm going to do that. And like many entrepreneurs before or since, many that I've talked to over my career as a journalist, if he'd had any idea how hard it was going to be, he probably wouldn't have done it, because it was incredibly hard to go from that little lab bench in his parents' house to commercial production. He essentially had to invent chemical engineering. He had to create all kinds of new processes and apparatuses, not only to make the dye, but to make the ingredients that went into the dye. But within a few years, he had done it, and the dye that became known as mauve became so popular and so common that satirists called it mauve measles. And then a few years later, this guy, Adolf von Baer, came along, and he figured out how to make indigo similarly in a lab, rather than by taking plants. And this was completely transformative, because before the invention of synthetic indigo, it used to take about 8 acres of indigo plants to dye a single acre's worth of cotton. And now we have so much indigo and so much thread and so much cloth that we actually have to invent machines to take it off in a fashionable way. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Virginia. That was a really fascinating and amazingly well done, speedy trip through how many centuries? I don't know. Was it like 13, 15 centuries? I don't know, something in that
The
neighborhood.
earliest is 6,200 years ago. So
yeah, well, that's seven centuries ago.
Although the book actually starts with Neanderthal string that's 50,000 years old.
Yeah, right. That was what I was thinking of, was something very, very far back.
Yeah.
We have a number of questions, but I'd like to just start by asking a little bit about how you see the connection. A lot of people are familiar with the future and its enemies. Your sort of serious launch into this kind of project, and I just wondered how you saw any of we can see the themes of how the future unfolds without our even realizing it. We don't plan the future, it kind of happens because somebody drops a chemical onto a piece of cloth and boom, something different happens, or something grows overnight on something and people discover that it has uses. But where in your history would you find the enemies of fabric progress? Do we have any such stories? And do you have any that you would, just the one or two to sort of?
Well, in the interest of time, I cut out one of my favorite things where I usually end, which is with the story of calico prohibition. Because for 73 years, starting under Louis XIV, France treated prints like what I have behind me, cotton prints, cotton cloth of all kinds, any kind of prints, basically the way the US treats cocaine. It was illegal to wear them, it was illegal to import them, but there was massive smuggling. And it was actually some of the earliest classical liberal writings on economics and also on the relationship between economics and justice come out of that experience of saying, we're putting people to death because they buy cloth in Switzerland where it's legal and bring it to France and sell it. And this is unjust. So that's what, and the reason for that prohibition was not a moral reason the way we might think of prohibition today. It was strictly a protectionist reason. It was that traders were bringing in printed cotton cloth from India. Indians had developed super finely spun threads and really good dyeing techniques. So everybody wanted this cloth, and it was competition for the existing industries. It was competition for the wool industry, for hemp, which was another natural fiber, for linen, and also, particularly in France, for silk, because it was actually, it was one of those things you could buy it at every price point, and there were very luxurious versions. And the silk industry, in particular, lobbied for this absolute prohibition. There were other prohibitions in, for example, Great Britain, but they weren't quite as extreme. So that's one of my favorite examples. And when I heard that, I couldn't believe that I didn't know about it because it's such an extreme example. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. We have a question about cotton. Richard Campbell asks, if cotton as we know it started in South America, what was it that the Egyptians raised, and was it, and that became a luxury product in the Roman Empire?
Right. So, okay. Cotton started in Africa, actually. That's where it all it spread to South America, and then the genetics made that cotton better, so then it sort of took over the world. So in places like Egypt and Sudan, and and actually throughout in West Africa, cotton was a very traditional fiber. Not so much Egypt, but farther south. It was a traditional fiber, and it was that native African plant. However, quote unquote Egyptian cotton, linen was the traditional Egyptian. If you go back to the days of the pharaohs and stuff, they were wearing linen. Quote unquote Egyptian cotton actually dates only back to the 19th century. There was a Frenchman who discovered some cotton in Egypt and spread it, and that very luxurious cotton. And I actually don't know whether that is where that cotton came from, but I'm guessing because of its characteristics that it actually came from Peru originally. So there is ancient cotton in Africa, although it tends to be a little bit farther south than Egypt.
So I'm going to move through, for the audience, I'm going to be moving through some of the questions asked because we probably have, we'll be accumulating a lot of questions. So Chloe Egan asks, was there a relationship between spinning becoming industrial and the respect that women received as hand spinners? Any connections there for women's work?
Well, I think that it probably cost women some respect when industrial spinning came around, because spinning had been such a central activity. Now, it was extremely low paid. And sometimes you will see, particularly feminist scholars, say it was low paid because women did it. That's not really the case. I mean, women had fewer options, so that hurt women. But it was really low paid because in order to make anything, it took so much time. But probably the transition into spinning as an industrial sort of mechanical factory activity did cost women a certain amount of prestige, and they became, their household relations became somewhat different. Although, particularly in the United States, a lot of the early workers in spinning factories were women. There was a slightly different technology that took over in Britain, and it tended to be a male occupation.
Interesting. We have an economics related question, so of course I have to get that one in there. From Dale Johnson. William Nordhaus and some other economists have used the cost of producing light as a way of measuring the economic efficiency of production throughout history. Based on your study of textiles, do you think that know of anyone who has done a similar analysis of the cost of producing textiles throughout history in any more detail than the spreadsheet you put up?
No. The short answer is no. People who study textiles tend to study specific textiles in specific places. So that spreadsheet that I put up is the only thing I've seen that is like that. Yeah.
Well, it suggests that there could be because it's certainly anything that that involves technology that goes back almost to the beginning of humanity could provide a way of tracking, efficiency and the cost of things that are used. So that'd be an interesting research project.
I mean, there certainly are. Yeah, there certainly are people who have studied pieces of that puzzle. That's how I was able to make that spreadsheet. I didn't do that research myself.
Yeah, I figured as much. So one of our audience members, Michael Giberson, he says he's thinking about buying a smartwatch, but maybe I should wait for smart textiles, as you suggested. What's your expectation for widespread availability of smart textiles in consumer applications?
That's a really good question. I mean, people are definitely working on it, but there are serious problems, a lot of them having to do with laundry. There are two big issues. One is laundry, and the other is the very different ways that the supply chains and just the whole production mindset are set up in the electronics industry versus the textile industry. I mean, people are definitely working on these issues, but they're tough. So if you're thinking about it's not going to be next year. So if you really want a smartwatch, you should go ahead and get it now.
Yes. Okay, great. Another question connected to sort of the history. The ships of ancient Rome, Greece, etc., had two sails. So perhaps it was the cost of sails that prohibited experimentation with multiple mast sails. and limiting their technological options. The HMS Victory mainsail, that it was comprised of rectangles of cloth, so they were put together to create the whole sail. Were sails before spinning all composed of smaller rectangles sewn together? And what do you think about experimentation with in the sailing industry?
I mean, it's an interesting hypothesis. I can't speak to it beyond as a hypothesis. It seems like it might be the case. And definitely sails were made by sewing together rectangles, because depending on the particular weaving technology, the size of those rectangles would vary. But yeah, that was definitely the way they were made.
Yeah, we've got a couple of questions that are just real specific about things, but it's kind of fun. When fiber was dyed blue with woad, did the dyers experience the same psychotropic effects that the Celtic warriors did?
Not that I know of. I don't think woad and indigo really have psychotropic effects, although you might, depending on what you put in the vat to make them work, you might have some. They mostly just got blue hands.
Yeah.
And it was smelly also.
Very smelly from having participated in that before. And of course, more smelly then than now. So,
yeah, not nearly as smelly as the Tyrian purple dye that was valued highly in the ancient world, that came from shellfish. That stuff is so smelly that 20 years later and washed with Tide, the fabric still smells. You could read about those experiments.
Yeah, I actually read about that in the book, and was reminded, but now, so are natural fibers going to go away in favor of synthetic fibers? Or is part of your message that there is nothing that is actually purely natural and everything has an element of synthetic to it?
Well, I mean, that is my message. Everything is artifice. Synthetic fibers are synthesized. That is, the fibers themselves are designed at the molecular level. And one way that we get a lot of characteristics that are desirable today, particularly in various kinds of athletic wear, is by manipulating the shapes of the fiber in ways that you can't do with biological fibers. I think looking long term, we're eventually going to see a third type of fiber, or fourth if you count. There are these things like rayon and lyocell that are called technically artificial fibers. That is, they come from, say, wood, but it's still made in a chemical process. The next phase will be fibers that come out of synthetic biology. And so this is the process of tricking bacteria, yeast, whatever, into secreting whatever it is you want. And that can be, among other things, protein polymers that can be turned into fiber. I mean, you can also make scents or flavors, or synthetic meat, theoretically. And this is a science that is increasingly well understood, but not as commercially viable as I think it will be in 10 years or so.
Yeah, interesting. What led you to this project now? I'm thinking about, I've been familiar with your work, as you know, at least since The Future and Its Enemies, also from your editorship of Reason. And, in looking backwards, I can kind of make sense of the progression, but, I don't know if you projected, The Fabric of Civilization as the next book, the book after the one I'm writing now, or something.
So no, I mean, the way I decide to do book topics is when something really engages my imagination. So in this case, over a period of 10 years or more, I saw exhibits, heard academic papers, read articles, whatever it might be, that made me think that the connection between textiles and technology specifically was really interesting and would be worth writing about. And that led to an article, which then led me to think, hey, this is a very rich subject. It could be a great book. And there are a couple years between the article and the book proposal. But, I just think it's a great I like to write about things that are really important, but under-recognized. So that's what it has in common with The Power of Glamour. There's not a whole lot else in common with that, but because this is much more back to my sort of nerdy roots. It's about science and technology and history and economics, as opposed to The Power of Glamour, which is really about rhetoric and visual persuasion. But I just thought this is a great way into the history of the world. And I learned a tremendous amount, not only about textiles, but about history, about geography, about cultural exchange, all kinds of things like that.
That's good. One of our former students here at ASU, who is heading on, I don't know yet where, because we haven't found out where he'll be accepted yet, but wonders what will happen in the so-called developing world with the industry, the textile industry. Will it? How will it change, or how do you think it will be changing in the near future?
Yeah, so this is a really interesting question because the textile industry historically, whether you're talking the Industrial Revolution or you're talking the development of Japan and Korea or China, has been the doorway into development. And that's still going on. So far, so good. But there are fears that various technological factors that make it easier to produce small batches closer to the final markets might cut that option out, because instead of making on the other side of the world and exporting, you'll produce small batches closer, to Los Angeles or wherever. The jury is still out on that. There are a lot of interesting things going on in textiles, particularly in computerized knitting, that can change the way they're produced. But we don't know, and there are also issues of whether, for example, India can be reliable enough in terms of having electricity and dealing with pollution and having large scale to develop as much as people hope it will.
One of the questions being asked is, you touched on the theme of the sort of the enemies of fabric progress. Could you elaborate a little bit more on what may lie behind their interest in trying to stop progress?
Well, one of the things that's most striking about the history of textiles, it's a big history and there are lots of examples, but is what happened in Great Britain when there were enormous protests against spinning machines and then later against power looms. And these were not ideological protests. We use the word Luddites to describe the people who protested power looms, but they weren't protesting on some anti-technological, ideological idea. They were just not wanting to lose their jobs, which you can be sympathetic to. But the government, the various authorities said, no, we're not going to stop these developments. We believe that they will be good overall for the prosperity of our communities and of our nation. And it turned out they were right, and of the world. But that is a very, very hard thing to do. It is hard to say this new technology that's coming along and disrupting everything, we're going to let it proceed, and we're going to accept the consequences, maybe try to figure out ways to ease people over the transition, but we're not going to say no. And you see that. So that's one theme. Another theme is that you see a lot of the advancement happening in situations where there's a lot of sharing of knowledge. Some of it is deliberate, and I write in the book about early books that were written which codified things that previously had been trade secrets, and some of it is just industrial espionage. I mean, that's and so the kind of locking up of knowledge that we see, through intellectual property law, which I'm not totally unsympathetic to, but you need to have it be a little bit loose. So, for example, with dyes, the way it was loose was that somebody like Perkin, he got a patent, but the patent was only in Great Britain. So somebody in Germany could come up with a German product, and that pushed not only not only made it possible to spread these new products faster, but it also created competition that pushed people to innovate and find better processes and cheaper ways of doing it, ways of making it more color fast, et cetera, et cetera. So I think sometimes we so appreciate the importance of creating incentives for innovators, which is a true thing, that we ignore the importance of allowing innovators to build on each other's work. And you do see that also in their number of textile examples, including the original spinning machines, where somebody came along and took inventions that had been made and didn't quite work and made them better. And the same thing happened with the Jacquard loom. He took ideas that a couple of previous inventors had developed that didn't quite work either, or they worked inefficiently, and he improved on it. And you need to allow that sort of thing.
Yeah. Well, one of the other questions is about, we've touched on this already, but I'd like to see how you take the question. Where do you see natural fibers fitting in as people become more eco-sensitive in the in all over the world?
Right. Well, they're definitely having something of a resurgence, but it's only something of a resurgence. You are seeing the reintroduction of hemp, which is, I always say that hemp went away for a reason, because compared to cotton, it was very unpleasant. It was very scratchy and coarse, but there are new ways of treating it that are called cottonification or something like that, cottonizing hemp. So there is an interest in natural fibers, biological fibers. The wool has only something like 2% of the market these days, and the wool producers are constantly trying to sell, particularly merino wool, as something that has good characteristics for athletic wear and that sort of thing. So far, they've barely made a dent. I mean, there's polyester, and then there is cotton, which has a much smaller market share than polyester, and then you get into other kinds of synthetic fibers. The artificial fibers like modal and lyocell, which are made from renewable sources, that is trees mostly, and are made in a more eco-friendly way than traditional rayon or viscose, it's also known as. They seem to be doing a little bit better. You see them more often, but so far there's a lot of talk about these various eco-friendly options and only a little bit of action.
Mm-hmm. And just repeating that message you've carried through this talk and also through the book is the line between natural and synthetic or artificial or whatever is has always been a little bit uh, artificial, in that there's always a new process, the use of a new material,
Right.
etc.
And yeah, and some of the people who are the most concerned about environmental spillovers and environmental, impacts are looking at things like synthetic biology as ways of ameliorating that. So
Right.
it's not a matter of going back necessarily to the past, but going forward to the future, but coming up with uh, new products that don't use fossil fuels and that are biodegradable and these sorts of, they have these sort of environmentally friendly characteristics, but are completely artificial in the sense that they are made in, they're designed in labs by manipulating microorganisms.
Thank you. Um, we had an earlier question from Chloe. I'll put this one and then give you a chance to wrap up. Related to the eco-friendly question, I read once that nylon is synthesized from carbon in some way. Is that true? And if so, can that be connected to carbon capture?
It is, and in fact, when nylon was introduced, the way DuPont sold it is they said it was made from coal, air, and water because it's basically carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. I don't think, I don't know enough about it, but I don't think it enables carbon capture. I think that more carbon is released in
Yeah.
production of it than is used.
Well, in the last couple minutes we have, I'd just like to give you a chance to kind of give a summary wrap up if you wanted to say anything sort of in conclusion.
Well, I think that textiles are something we all use every day. We're constantly surrounded by them. We tend to take them completely for granted, and I think that's wonderful that we can, because it means we live in a world of textile abundance, but it's given us what I call textile amnesia. And the result of that is that exploring the history of textiles is a wonderful way to explore the history of human culture, of human ingenuity, of science, technology, of economics, of geography, all of these things. And it's been a great adventure for me, and I hope it will be for readers as well.
Thank you. And as a recent reader of the book, I'm happy to just hold the cover up again to say that The Fabric of Civilization, How Textiles Made the World is a very insightful read. You learn a lot, and also just a marvelous a trip through sort of how the world actually works in the world of textiles and other products, that is far more complex, not top down, and full of real stories of real people than we often think they are. And Virginia, I really thank you for joining us, and look forward to talking to you again sometime.
Thanks very much.
Yeah, and I should just say that if you want to support future events like this one, you can support the Center for the Study of Economic Liberty and go to the website to do that. Thank you very much for all your assistance and listening, and we look forward to talking to you again, Virginia, sometime.